Trump, as always, taco, he's moved from I want regime change to, well, maybe we don't really need democracy in in Iran.
Iran was deeply underestimated. From the time of the 12-day war until now, there was at least 7 months. During that time, I think Iran knew that they were going to be struck. They just didn't know when. The fact that it was during Ramadan is definitely not a surprise to the Muslim world.
At the end of the day, Trump can stop this war if he wants to. And he's not fighting it on any ideological grounds. Netanyahu, on the other hand, has out and said this is a 40-year-old dream for him to destroy the Islamic Revolution in Iran.
The last thing the Houthis would want to see now is ground forces with the government, with a joint Israeli-US striking package attacking them.
The fact is that the nuclear threat is bogus. They keep repeating it because it's catchy, and a lot of people will go along, oh my God, nuclear weapons in the hands of Iran. The fact is, they tout how close Iran is. Iran has been technically close to make a nuclear bomb for 15 years.
Welcome to FO Live. Today I'm joined by eminent guests to talk about the ongoing war in the Middle East. With me is Dr. Nabeel Khoury, former Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Sana'a. We also have Heena Lotus, a journalist whose work focuses on the Middle East. We also have Mohammad Basha, who is a renowned independent Middle East analyst and founder of Basha Report. Last to least, we also have Fernando Carvajal. You all may know him very well. He is a prominent guest at Fair Observer. He writes for us, he speaks to us, and he is everything. He knows everything that you need to know about Yemen. But very quickly, I want to begin with you, Dr. Nabeel. What does this war mean for the Middle East? And let me just give you some context, because February 28, Israel and the United States carry out strikes. They call it preemptive strikes in Iran. They take out the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. They also take out senior IRGC leadership. Where are we heading now?
Okay, thanks, and glad to be with you all. I think if we start from the latest statements, you go to Donald Trump's first stated goal and his estimate of how long it would last. From 4 days to very soon it was 4 weeks. Then it was open-ended. And then he was back to saying it will end very quickly because we've run out of targets. It's very hard to pin him down. And therefore, it's very hard to take these pronouncements as serious. And the Secretary of Defense, even though he likes to call himself Secretary of War, I think it's telling. Also, the statements are not reliable. And I think a lot of people around the world, in the Middle East included, because most countries in the Middle East are split. Even in Lebanon, people are divided on what they expect from this war, what they expect from the US. But despite all the confusion, I think the Omani statement is probably closest to what's really going on, because if the goals keep shifting from the US point of view, from the Israeli point of view, I don't think they've shifted much. And away from whether it was the nuclear thing or the missiles or support for regional proxies, as they call them, the Omanis went through all this and said, the real goal is Israel's domination of the Middle East and the greater Middle East, not just the classic Middle East, and squashing any resistance to their policies in general, but specifically, it all goes back to Palestine. It all goes back to the 2-year war on Gaza. They would like to, the extreme right wing, that's what we're talking about in Israel. We're not talking about all Israeli factions. Obviously, the Israeli left is different. But it all goes back to what the Israeli right wants to do, at a minimum, is control all of historic Palestine. And beyond that, to have what they call zones of influence or security belts in Syria, in Lebanon, elsewhere if they can. They've now engaged 7 or 8 different fronts that they are bombing in the region. So the goal is to seriously degrade Iran's power and influence in the region to the point where it cannot oppose them anymore. Iran certainly has not initiated this war either towards Israel or towards the US. And the idea that Iran posed an existential threat to Israel is totally irrational, not realistic. And even more absurd is the claim that Iran posed a threat to the US. So in the end, you figure that this is not defensive on the part of the US and Israel. It's rather expansive. It expands the zone of influence, the dominance of the region. And if viewed in this lens, then count the human toll in the Middle East, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and now in Syria and Iraq as well. Not yet in Yemen, but that could come next, depending. And then you count the cost to the world economy, the chaos that this is raising, the havoc it's wreaking on the world economy. And you have to wonder, as a rational person, as a human being, is this cost worth whatever they think they're getting out of this war? And on a purely realpolitik level, it's hard to see that this war will actually achieve that expansive goal. I am old enough to have closely witnessed the 1982 invasion, the Israeli invasion that reached Beirut, and that aimed at degrading and removing the PLO from Lebanon, which it succeeded in doing. And in the same process, it led to the creation of Hezbollah, which up to that point had not existed. And very soon after, it led to the creation of Hamas in Palestine. In other words, violence begets violence. And if this war succeeds in degrading, it has already degraded the power of Hezbollah and certainly the power of Hamas. If it does that, if it even removes these organizations, you can bet, studying from history what happened before, that new, perhaps more militant organizations will rise, because the anger that this war is causing will only bring new violence. It may take a couple of years before new organizations rise, but it will come for sure. So somebody is not learning the lesson from history and the lesson from their own mistakes in the past. And I will leave it at this, and then we'll engage in discussion.
Right. Well, Fair Observer's founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief Atul Singh has repeatedly said that if you take out Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, if you take out senior leadership in the IRGC, it just creates more room for black beards to replace white beards. Powerful men with more testosterone, with more aggression, and that's kind of something that we're seeing right now. And Fernando, this is where I want you to come in and tell us. Well, Israel and the United States say that they've weakened Iran, they've weakened IRGC, but yet we're seeing these drone attacks, we're seeing missile launches, not just at Israel, at other Gulf states as well. What is your assessment? For Iran, this is a fight for survival. And what's interesting is, and I want you to bring in the aspect of Yemen as well, because in 2025, when we had the 12-day war, the Houthis also fired at Israel. They've been somewhat silent. So first, what does this war mean for Iran? And second, are we going to see the Houthis joining in?
Thank you, Rohan. And definitely, I am the observer. We have two very senior observers in Basha and Dr. Nabeel. So we'll definitely get them on this. One of the things to follow up on Dr. Khoury's and your question is, Trump, as always, taco, he's moved from, I want regime change to, well, maybe we don't really need democracy in Iran, and maybe I want to choose, just like in Venezuela, I choose who the next head of Iran is. Completely delusional, right? When it comes to politics. But to this question, as Dr. Khoury says, Nabeel, we're seeing a shift in the balances that is truly bringing observers, political scientists, those who study national security, Gulf security, etc., into a new way of thinking because of the way this war is being conducted. It is regime survival for Iran. And if we read across the publications over the last 2 weeks, whether the Islamic revolution continues under the Ayatollahs or it continues as a revolution under the Revolutionary Guard, right? Another thing that we've discussed is a couple of observers, a couple of analysts have said, who's running the war in Tehran? Is it the military? Is it the white beards, as you mentioned? Because some of these irrational strikes, as some people would say, attacking Oman, a vital Iranian ally, attacking Khattar again after 2025 strikes on the US base. And so from some perspectives, some may say this is irrational. But on another perspective, Iran, we can definitely see that Iran was prepared for this, and Basha can get into that, but Iran was definitely prepared for this type of war because it has been very tactical on the infrastructure and the military bases that it's hit across the Gulf. And basically the conspiracy theory, that I will advance in a little bit is sort of the regime in Iran saying, if the US and Israel are going to set us back to 20 years ago, then we're going to make sure that our neighbors are not ahead of us, because the neighbors are a threat itself to Iran. It's not just the US and Israel, it is the Gulf that present a certain threat to the Iranian regime. Why Yemen and the Houthis in Yemen have not joined? Bash has been producing a lot of material on this, just published another article about this, but from my perspective, we can look back to December. Let's recall that the Houthis and Saudis have had a détente agreement since April 2022. Right. And even though the Houthis have claimed to attack Israel over Saudi territory, the Saudis have been very blunt about this, and they've shut down a few missiles and drones that have tried to cross through Saudi territory. It is for the Houthis, after the pounding they took in May of last year, if you recall the airstrikes by U.S. Yes. Operation Rough Rider, the pounding that the Houthis took last year weakened its leadership and weakened its arsenal, right, at home, in the drones and the missiles. How much, we don't know yet, because we haven't seen much movement in the Houthis, from my perspective. But the Houthis are, from my perspective, the Houthis are at a point where they really need a deal with Saudi Arabia. They're desperate for a deal with Saudi Arabia. And now that Saudi Arabia has taken a very strong stand in South Yemen to expel the UAE influence and expel the Saudi secessionists, the Houthis really see an opportunity to make a good deal with the Saudis. And if the Houthis were to join this war with Iran, it would upset that balance. There are rumors that there is a secret deal with the Houthis where the Saudis are paying in order to keep them on the sidelines. But the Houthis have a very distinct calculation of the conflict where we're not seeing the same aggression that we've seen since October 7, 2023, attacking the ships, attacking Israel. We have not seen much military movement other than on the ground, but this is because of their national rivals. So Basha could get more, and Dr. Nabeel can get more into this, and Heena can describe more into how it affects the Gulf neighbors as well.
Right. So how about I do that? Basha, can you quickly come in and tell us, were the Houthis hit that badly that they're just not willing to join the fight this time? I mean, last night we saw the Hezbollah joining in, and I believe they launched more than 100 rockets into northern Israel. They even hit Haifa. But the Houthis have been largely silent, and that's strange. Why do you think that is the case?
I think people are surprised that the Houthis are not attacking the maritime sector these days, or attacking the Gulf. And I think the people will not be surprised if the Houthis, for example, tomorrow resume the attacks. So the surprise coming from the Turkish today is because the Houthis are not doing much. But if they do things tomorrow, everybody will be, this is business as usual. I think it's a culmination of things. One, I will agree that this is linked to Saudi Arabia. This is linked to the Houthis since November have not been engaged in kinetic activities that will challenge the fragile truce it has with Saudi Arabia. So, for example, in December and in January, when Saudi led the coalition to expel UAE-backed forces from east of Yemen and had to withdraw forces from the border and had to withdraw forces from the front lines with the Houthis, a lot of people expected the Houthis to take advantage of what happened and carry out operations. Nothing happened. Now, since we're now day 13 or about to enter day 2 weeks into the conflict, nothing happened. So this is the Houthis trying to show that maybe this time we want to be the good guys. We want to be the wild ones in the scene, sort of like what STC did in December, January, and sort of to what the other Iranian groups are doing in the region. So why are they doing that? I think the Houthis financially today are cash strapped, and they're a roadmap for peace under the auspices of the UN will give them a minimum of $100 million a month in salary support that the Houthis need desperately. This is the first Ramadan month where even a half a salary to the forces was not paid. We're seeing signs of them, tearing down walls of mosques to build up shops to generate income. Businesses are fleeing north of Yemen. Banks, because of FTO and sanctions, have moved and relocated to Aden. Real estate market is not generating income for them. And you've reached the maximum of taxing the local population that you're not really generating much revenue. And on the other hand, they're seeing the Saudis giving the government $300 million in salaries and $500 million in projects. So the Houthis are like, hey, like we've been, we've been showing, good signs of us not escalating on war. And so, we need to be compensated for that. The second thing I would argue is the agency and ownership of this. So the Houthis don't want to be seen as an Iranian proxy. They want to be seen as they have their own independent mindset, and Abdel Malik al-Houthi, their leader, has the decision himself to launch an operation, or the decision for, like they say in Lebanon, decision for war and peace comes by Abdel Malik al-Houthi himself and nobody else. And so they're trying to show that they will join this war when they see it's an appropriate time. There's a lot of leaked rumor intelligence these days that some of these strikes that have been going around the Gulf area are emanating from the Houthis, and most of these rumors are coming from Houthi adversaries. Houthi adversaries are eager to see the U.S. and Israel and the Saudi-led coalition resume operations against the Houthis, and the Houthis know that, and that gives us reason number three. Is now that the UAE is out, Saudi Arabia has united to an extent the anti-Houthi coalition under one command. The last thing the Houthis would want to see now is ground forces with the government, with a joint Israeli-US striking package attacking them. That's going to be a very difficult thing for them. Fourth, I will argue, is operational security. The Houthis will deny it every day, but they've been infiltrated, and that's very clear from CENTCOM being able to eliminate their drone commanders. The IDF eliminated in an unannounced government meeting in a private house half of the government and killed their general chief of staff. It was a painful strike. If you drive around Sana'a today, billboards and the portraits of their general major Mohammad al-Ghammari is all over. So that's been hit. Now, in light of today's speech by the new supreme leader of Iran, where he specifically hailed the forces in Yemen, he did not mention the Houthis, so that they won't be labeled as just one entity, and provide that impression that the whole of Yemen is supporting the Iranian-backed Axis. He said that they've done studies and they're exploring the possibilities of carrying out, expanding the operations. And there's a bunch of anonymous Iranian generals yesterday on Al-Mayadeen, and Al Jazeera also hinted at the possibility of opening a new front on another strait, which means Bab al-Mandab Strait, and the Houthis getting involved. I think if this conflict continues for another month, I think eventually the Houthis will join. While they are publicly saying their official line is, we're not doing anything because Iran does not need help. In reality, on the ground, they've mobilized all their drone and missile forces and brigades throughout their AOs to carry out operations.
Heena, I want you to jump in and tell us how the Arab world is feeling, because when Iran started retaliating, first they struck Israel, then they struck U.S. assets, American military assets in the Middle East, and that included air bases in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE. But now Iran's strategy has dangerously evolved, because now they're going after civilian infrastructure, including oil tankers, including oil storage units, including oil refineries, water desalination plants. How is the Middle East feeling? Do you think, first of all, why aren't they retaliating? Why aren't they the ones striking Iran? And secondly, do they feel that the United States and Israel have taken them to a war that they didn't really want?
This is actually a phenomenal question. Thank you, for having me on. This is something that a lot of people are discussing. And what it basically comes down to is the fact that the GCC has historically aligned itself with the Western Bloc. But as a byproduct of it having the military bases, allowing the US to use its airspace to strike Iran, it's having ramifications much wider than they were expecting. It's hitting infrastructure, it's hitting civilian areas, it's, taking a toll on the economy, not just with the GCC bill. It is now affecting the GCC countries as well when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. So because it's taking such a big hit, I think these countries were expecting the US to intervene and protect it. And I think what these countries are realizing at this point is that being a Western Bloc aligned, entity per se, is turning into a liability. not only is it not benefiting this region, but it's turning into something that is, widely like creating a lot of chaos, a lot of, wide scale panic. You see right now in Bahrain, they have a lot of protests going on, a lot of issues right now going against like the main government. And I think that is, a lot of people are saying it's the regime change that the United States wasn't asking for, but potentially will get. I don't know if that's something that will happen as easily as people are predicting, but that is something that I don't think the United States was ready for. So you also have to understand the fact that Iran was deeply underestimated. From the time of the 12-day war until now, there was at least 7 months. During that time, I think Iran knew that they were going to be struck. They just didn't know when. The fact that it was during Ramadan is definitely not a surprise to the Muslim world, because this is something that is military strategy for the United States. But this being prefaced, we have to remember that Iran has thousands and thousands of interceptors. They have a lot of military equipment and weapons from China. The United States was not ready for the ramifications that they are seeing. They've had to go as far as taking the infrastructure from South Korea, which is one of the biggest allies to Israel and the United States in that region, as a byproduct of the damages that have been sustained. This is now leaving South Korea in a very vulnerable position. So essentially what you're seeing is this domino effect, where all these different allies are realizing that they are actually very, very vulnerable. And the priority at the end of the day is Israel and not them. And as they're slowly realizing that they are essentially pawns, it's making them now question where their allegiance lies, because there comes a point where you are an ally because it's an incentive to you. Now that it's not an incentive to them and they are being, brutally impacted on a multitude of different levels, whether you look at it from a military perspective, an economic perspective, political perspective, they now have to kind of put themselves first. And that's what we're basically seeing come about. So you see, various different countries in the GCC saying we're no longer going to allow our airspace to be used, or we're no longer going to do X, Y, and Z. I was just reading as of, this morning or perhaps yesterday that a bank in Tehran was targeted, and as a byproduct, Iran is now going to go after banks. So Citibank, as of this morning, announced that they will be, shutting down infrastructure in various different parts of the GCC as well. This is turning into a huge catastrophe, and I think the United States needs to wake up and realize that it's losing its allies very quickly that go beyond the GCC.
Right. I want to open the floor to everyone, and we can just, everyone can just chime in wherever they feel is necessary. And I want to largely talk about whether the United States and Israel and President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have largely miscalculated this war, because when they took out Khamenei on day one, they were expecting thousands of Iranians to come to the street and overthrow the IRGC, overthrow the government. That's not been the case. In fact, we've had more protests in Pakistan and in India, largely from the Shia community, that are protesting against the United States, against the Israeli action. And the regime stands tall. They've been hit. Yes, the Iranian Air Force has been completely demolished. The Navy has been largely sunk. Yet Iran's got missiles. They've got drones, and it looks like the people are now rallying behind the Ayatollahs. How do you think this is going to play out now?
Who's going to take a shot first?
Dr. Khoury, how about we start with you?
Sure. First of all, I think that one thing allies should realize, there is a difference between Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu. For all the different political pronouncements from Donald Trump about the regime, about the rights of women, on and on, in the end of the day, Donald Trump, for all his faults, is not an ideologue. And he really doesn't care what type of regime exists in Iran any more than he cares what type of regime is in Venezuela. And he is willing to deal with anybody. And in fact, dealing with dictators and autocrats is easier for him. He can just pick up the phone and talk to one person rather than try to convince an entire democratic system. Um, what he cares about is people do what he tells them to do. When he said, I will decide who the next leader in Iran is going to be, he wants someone who will kowtow and who will open access to businesses that Trump and family and friends would benefit from. And therefore, anytime Iran offers, and I'm surprised they didn't think of offering something lucrative before they were attacked, they could have swayed him. He could stop tomorrow if Mujtaba, which is unlikely, were to say, "Okay, let's stop, and American businesses can now come back, oil companies can come back to Iran." And by the way, hush hush, in a secret phone call, you can have Trump Tower in Tehran. And he would stop the war tomorrow. And he could. I mean, certainly from the US point of view, he could stop it any minute. But he can even get tough with Netanyahu and tell him to desist. And really, Israel cannot engage Iran in a long-term war, all-out war by itself. So in the end of the day, Trump can stop this war if he wants to. And he's not fighting it on any ideological grounds. Netanyahu, on the other hand, has out and said this is a 40-year-old dream for him to destroy the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And in fact, this is not just against the regime. This is against the country. This is against the nation. There has already been tremendous destruction of civilian life and civilian infrastructure. If the war goes on, the plans are on the table, both in the Pentagon and in Tel Aviv, for the total destruction, not just of military, but of civilian infrastructure. And I'm talking about roads, bridges, factories of all kinds. This has already been brought up that if you seriously want to defeat an enemy, you want to defeat their industrial base so that it doesn't come back. If you leave the industrial base intact, they can reproduce the weapons that you destroy now. So total victory means the total destruction of civilian and not just military infrastructure. So that the difference between Trump and Netanyahu should be emphasized. Now, very quickly on the Houthis, I agree with everything that Basha said about the cost of life for them these days, and therefore the cost of war, relationship with Saudi Arabia, and how important that rapprochement has been for them with the Saudis. I would add that from a strategic point of view, you have to think, first of all, positively. If they are going to positively contribute to the war effort, what is it that they can do actually against Israel? They certainly do not have the ability for a ground engagement. And their missiles have proven that they can shoot a few missiles here and there, but they do not have even the missile capability that Hezbollah has in Lebanon. And therefore, in the end of the day, a direct engagement of Israel doesn't hurt Israel that much from the Houthis. What the Houthis can contribute is the closure of Bab el-Mandeb. That would hurt everybody. But here's the second point I want to make. It would hurt them as well. That in addition to what they've suffered so far, if you close the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, and now any smuggling into northern Yemen becomes impossible. In addition to those two, in other words, they used to get things through the Red Sea, and they used to get things from the south of Yemen, infiltrated the Mahara region, Hadramaut region. Now that zone is filled up with ships waiting in line to enter Hormuz, and U.S. naval ships are there. So it becomes very difficult. By choking the international economy, they choke themselves as well. And therefore, they want to hold off as long as possible before jumping into that fray. And from Iran's point of view, I think they'd be wise to kind of leave that powder dry, so to speak, until absolutely necessary. And here, I agree with Basha that if this goes on and widens, at some point the Houthis will feel they have to jump in. It becomes an all or nothing situation, much as it is for Iran right now. At some point, for the Houthis, they say, we're losing everything anyway. And if the total destruction of Iran looks imminent, at some point they will feel obligated to jump in and do the best they can. And then all of us have to worry about that.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you've got the United States and Israel both attacking Iran, but their motives are seeming to be totally different. For Trump, it was about getting a pro-American regime in Iran, removing IRGC, getting access to Iranian oil, perhaps doing more business. But for Israel, Israel cites the Iranian threat as an existential threat because they say that Iran is on its way to building a nuclear weapon, and if they are indeed capable and they do in fact build a nuclear weapon, it poses an existential threat for Israel because let's say one missile goes through, one warhead goes through. Israel is a tiny country. So Israel's perception of the threat perception of Iran is totally different to that of the United States. Now, the way the war is going and the way it drags on, there is a high possibility that Donald Trump will want to pull out. Where does that leave Israel?
Let me jump in on the point you mentioned from an Israeli point of view, existential threat. I don't think Iran has ever been an existential threat for Israel. It's been a strong voice of resistance, of opposition, but not existential threat.
Netanyahu calls them an existential threat. I think it's Netanyahu's
they
policy.
call it, and that's Netanyahu makes statements much like Trump does for political consumption, not based on fact. The fact is that the nuclear threat is bogus. They keep repeating it because it's catchy, and a lot of people will go along. Oh my God, nuclear weapons in the hands of Iran. The fact is, they tout how close Iran is. Iran has been technically close to make a nuclear bomb for 15 years. I recall well when I was still at the State Department and following this issue closely, that US intelligence at the time estimated, I'm going back to 2010, 2011, estimated that if the Iranians decided to produce an atomic bomb, they could do so within a few months, 3 to 4 months. They had the technical capability back then. Of course, it would take longer to produce more than one bomb. But that the Iranians never made the decision to produce a nuclear weapon. And that was true in 2010 as up to now. Now, I don't know, after this, ironically, this fierce attack on them may actually cause the thinking that, you know what, if we had a nuclear weapon, that would be a true deterrent. So
Absolutely.
Why don't we work on it? But up to now, and Khamenei, whom they assassinated, was the one who gave the fatwa and said, we don't want such a weapon. that it didn't coincide, it didn't jive with his view of the world, with his sense of morality, with his sense of religion. Now, I don't know if Mujtaba will continue with this or not, but up to this point, this has been a bogus argument. It was never a nuclear threat from Iran.
Right. Well, Basha and Fernando, you both have been watching this conflict, and this is not the only conflict that you've been watching. But from your understanding, and given the statements that are coming out of the Trump administration of possibly putting boots on the ground, do you think that is eventually going to happen in Iran? Because let's remember, Iran is not an easy country to navigate. The topography is extremely rough. It's cold, it's dry, it's mountainous. Of course, Iranians have the upper hand. I mean, the Americans didn't stop in Iraq. Why would they stop now? What do you think?
Take a
Well, talking about Iraq, again, I'm going to mention an article I wrote this week for Homeland Security Today. In this article, I argue that the best way to understand the White House policy is actually listen to what the president is saying. And so when President Trump said that, for the past 47 years, every time you walk around and you see a handicapped soldier that been wounded from an IED from the Iraq War, there's deep, deep, difficult memories within the national security and military establishment in the U.S. from what Iran did with its proxies in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and so on. And so, that's coming from the commander in chief himself. That's his argument. But right now, you're also hearing from the president and from the Department of War and CENTCOM that what I see are the talking points for mission accomplished. We've destroyed the Iranian Navy. We've destroyed the Iranian Air Force. We've destroyed half of their, or a large section of their missile launchers. Industrial military complex factories have been damaged. Nuclear sites have been flattened out, and so you could argue that a lot of these military objectives that have been carried on will give enough space for the U.S. administration, the current administration, to say, "Hey, mission accomplished," and we'll pull out. But like I argued earlier, I don't think Iran will stop. I think Iran right now is gonna raise the ceiling in ways that's gonna make a lot of us in the West uncomfortable, and I'm just very concerned about the what ifs. What if an Iranian missile is able to strike a carrier group, or or sink a frigate or a war destroyer? Like, what if we have a mass casualty incident where instead of controlled numbers of U.S. personnel were killed, so far I think it's less than 10. But what if we have an incident where the mass casualty is hundreds and thousands, and then I think boots on the ground will be the next step. I'm seeing scenarios where troops could be sent to Iraq to uh, create some sort of a buffer zone to cut off the ground lines of communications between Iraq and Iran. The president himself mentioned Haraj Island, and so we could see an amphibious attack to capture that island, even though I think Iranians will bomb it if the Americans capture the island. I'm also seeing a scenario that down the range, naval blockade where Iranian tankers are going to be seized by the U.S. Navy. So you know it's hard for me to say right now, and this is what my clients ask me every day, is as a risk advisor, have we crossed the point of no return? Is this is just going to be the new norm of a protracted long-term conflict, tit for tat attacks? Because even if the US, let's say the US pulls out next week, I think Israel and Iran will continue at this for a couple of more weeks, and then you're going to have the Houthis dragged in, more involvement by the Iraqi groups, and yes, there are cells, there are pro-Iranian cells throughout this world, and God knows what plans and capabilities. There are FBI warnings today, possible attacks here in the homeland, and more than that. And so, the question right now is like, can we go back to diplomacy? Because I don't see a scenario right now where we could say that a regime will be toppled. I disagree with that assessment. In fact, I think that Khamenei's replacement, his son, and the new commands are going to be out for blood. His speech today was full of blood. He mentioned revenge for his father, revenge for his family, revenge for the people of Iran, and a very hardcore, hardline message that came out today. So hard to see where the world could move in right now to provide an exit ramp for everybody.
Right. Well, one of the reports that I've read is that the Americans, especially the CIA, is willing to supply arms to the Kurds and to the Balochis in Iran, and possibly create more internal conflict. And Heena, I want you to talk about this because there's a big country in this region that is playing a very important role, and that is Pakistan. And ever since this conflict began, Pakistan was very smart in their diplomacy, because they condemned the strikes on Iran, and they also condemned Iran's strikes on other GCC members. Pakistan also has a strategic mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia, and to honor that, they have actually deployed some air defense units to Riyadh. But interestingly, Pakistan shares a border with Iran, and tensions between the two countries have been high. In fact, in 2024, there was a missile shooting contest between Iran and Pakistan, and it was about the Balochis. So if the Americans are serious about arming the Balochis in Iran, Pakistan's certainly not comfortable. So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think this is going to be one of the ways that the United States is going to create more unrest in Iran, by supporting the Kurds in the northwest and supporting the Balochis in southeast of Iran? And of course, Pakistan has a great role when it comes to the Balochis.
This is such an interesting question. If you had asked me now, and in your question, there was multiple questions, so I'll address one by one. You have to understand that the US media was reporting that the CIA was training, strategic Kurdish separatist groups that were willing to fight on behalf of them against, the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime, as well as the Kurds, basically came out and said this is not true. So this is actually a form of information warfare, as far as concerned, or as I've studied this. And we also have to remember that the Kurds have been US allies over and over, and we've seen what happened to them under Trump's first administration with northern Syria. We also saw the US basically abandon them over and over again while they were fighting ISIS and various different military objectives that the US had. And so from my understanding, the Syrian Kurds as well as the Iraqi Kurds did come out with a letter that said that we are no longer going to be a US proxy. We are no longer aligned with the US. We are used over and over again. And this is something that we do not want to be involved with, which I think was extremely bold because, historically speaking, the Kurds have always aligned with the US. So for them to also bow out of this, whereas the US, and the media, the MSM per se was reporting otherwise, actually shows that Iran is doing much better than everyone expected. And I think the US was trying to save face, which both, these Kurdish groups as well as the Iranian regime said, hey, this is incorrect. In terms of the Balochi groups, that is actually really interesting. As we know, that is, a very hot topic when it comes to Pakistani politics. At the end of the day, the US does invest heavily into these Balochi separatist groups that do want their own, ethno-state, nation state. And so the Balochis usually have historically, fought on beats and aligned with the US because of the funding. I'm not so sure if the Balochis will get in this. And I think the reason for that is globally, not just regionally. Everyone sees that Iran is winning, not just by a little bit, but by tenfold. So anyone that gets involved at this point is now going to be putting themselves as a liability. It's not something that's going to be an incentive on their regard. We have to remember that when it comes to geopolitics, countries don't get involved usually because of morality. They look at it in terms of their own infrastructure. They look at it in terms of military, economic gains, trade deals, securing ports. I don't think the Balochis have anything to gain out of getting involved. So that is just my analysis on that. It could obviously change. It's been very volatile, but at this point, with the way that everything is going with Iran, everyone is seeing the damage that the GCC has sustained, the damage that Israel has sustained, and this is despite all of these governments basically telling their own people, hey, it's illegal for you to, take photographs. It's illegal for you to take videos. So what we are seeing in our media, independent as well as MSM, is a fraction of what's going on. So I think these separatist groups understand that. In terms of Pakistan, that's actually a very interesting question. Coming into this conflict, I thought that it would be 100% US aligned. I actually think that for lack of a better term, Pakistan is being diplomacy's final boss. It's kind of playing all sides. We saw that they were having conversations with, the president of Iran, as well as, Russia, where they're saying, hey, we are standing behind you. We also saw Pakistan speaking out heavily against, the killing of Khamenei. But we also see them, going against the strikes on the GCC. This is obviously due to the security pact that Pakistan has with Saudi Arabia. But then you also see Saudi Arabia was willing to get involved, and Pakistan said, hey, stand down. So Pakistan is all over the place. I think they are just trying to, neutral is not the right word. I think they're just trying to play all sides and, remain diplomatic and in good graces with the US, with Saudi Arabia, with the GCC countries, with Iran. I think that they are doing an incredible job so far, but sometimes playing all sides also shoots you in the foot. So I think that's something that we're going to have to just keep an eye on at the end of the day.
Right. Fernando, I saw you smiling earlier, so I just had to ask you to jump in.
No, thank you. And if you remember, Rohan, we actually discussed the Saudi-Pakistan deal in our last conversation, where I said, this deal, will Pakistan risk their soldiers for Saudi Arabia, or will Saudi Arabia risk their soldiers for Pakistan? So clearly, the limits to these alliances, these security pacts, because we can't yet call them formal alliances in a way. So the whole Pakistan issue, as Heena says, is walking that fine line, staying on the wall, and not making a decision, because at the end of the day, there's India, there's Afghanistan, right? So these are high stakes for countries, Pakistan. To one point that Basha mentioned with regards to diplomacy, if we believe the early reports where mainstream media claimed that this war had been prepared by Netanyahu and Trump's people for a month, and Iran had long and dragged along with Oman as a mediator, why would Iran trust diplomacy? And I think a couple of Iranian officials have already said that we're beyond diplomacy for this. There is no ceasefire. It's either the end of the conflict or nothing, because a ceasefire is just, misdirection. They're not willing to be fooled again. Dr. Khoury, if you remember Bush Jr., his whole blunder about you fooled me once, you fooled me twice. The Iranians are not going to make that mistake.
But you can't
at the
fool me
military.
again, is what he said.
Right. The Iranian military in specific, I think, believe in the theory that the Iranian military is really at the head, at the leader, perhaps to a degree of decentralization with some of these strikes. I did want to make a couple of points regarding the U.S.-Israel, and I think we really do not see any discussion on the divergence between between Netanyahu and Trump, and I think this is where we get where even MAGA, if we look at MAGA's defection, their defection from Trump at the moment is really based on, we didn't sign up to fight for Israel, right? That means MAGA at its core does not see a benefit from this war. And this is a year into an economic crisis, really, in the US, right? Where we're hiding the numbers on unemployment, on inflation. But this war, more than the Bab al-Mandab issue, I've argued that the Houthi operations in Bab al-Mandab had less than 3% impact on the global economy and near zero in the US economy, because we don't depend on that traffic. California, my home state, has suffered because it's a direct link between China and the US, right? But MAGA this year, if this war continues even another week, the impact is already there in the long term, I believe, economically. And MAGA in a midterm election year is really hurting, and this is going to hurt Trump. This is why we saw yesterday starting the rallies in MAGA territory. So Bibi, in the one hand, needs this war to, he's done with Gaza. He needs this war politically and militarily at home. And while many of us would say, well, civilians being pounded in Israel should be the end of Bibi. It should be the end of Netanyahu politically. But he's, the right wing is stronger than ever. And this, every strike from Iran inside Tel Aviv, it just merely reinforces the right wing, and then the Palestinians end up getting the blunt of it. One last thing, to Basha's comment regarding the long term of this war. I think that I've been talking about this since last year, since May. What Netanyahu started is a long-term war against the US. And I always like to bring up the Chinese saying on death by 1,000 cuts. Iran is an entity that relies on multiple, it's like an octopus. It relies on multiple arms when it comes to warfare. And the number of militia, the number of the asymmetric warfare that will come, it's not if it comes, it will come, does involve sleeping cells, if you want to call it that, militias, but we will be hit because this type of regime does not just sign an agreement and move on in peace and forgets the past. And so this MAGA Trump administration has really brought the war home, in my opinion. When we all thought the 9/11 was the end, was the last on the U.S. strikes, and again, we've seen Iran strike Israel and Argentina, strike Israel in Africa, where you don't expect it. Why? Because these are very soft targets. It doesn't have to be a drone in Los Angeles. It doesn't have to be an incident in DC. It could be Nairobi. It could be Sierra Leone, anywhere in the world, because the impact of this type of warfare, the goal is just to hit back and make you think that you're not safe and secure anywhere in the world.
Right. Fernando, I think you're absolutely bang on when it comes to understanding how MAGA is feeling about this war, because I was going through Vice President J.D. Vance's Twitter account, X account, and he hasn't really been retweeting or posting images and videos that are being put out by CENTCOM, that are being put out by Pete Hegseth, that are being put out by Donald Trump himself about the war. But when you look at Pete Hegseth's account, it's everything is about the war. So clearly the vice president is not really on board, or doesn't seem to be on board with the war. But Dr. Khoury, I want to end this discussion with you. You're the diplomat. I want you to give us a sense of how do you think this war can end? And the reason I'm asking this is Iran has probably lost all trust in not just the United States, but in other global institutions as well. We all know that Iran did sign the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which Trump did in fact pull out of. In fact, even this time, Iran and the United States were holding fresh talks in Oman about the nuclear program. And during these talks is when the strikes began. So if I'm Iranian, from Iran's vantage point, there is no meaning for diplomacy. How do you read this?
Well, I mean, as a diplomat, I have to say that there is always room for diplomacy. And historically, all wars end with some kind of a diplomacy. So this war, as bad as it is not going to go on forever. At some point, somebody is going to stop. And at that point, there will be talks. Oman, for all that it feels that it has been betrayed by both sides, maybe, is still ready to jump in as a mediator. And when the guns fall silent, Oman will be there. Qatar will most likely be there as well to mediate and try to bring some sense of rationality and humanity to the situation. That said, I think one has to be careful with what people say, Trump and others, about American deaths and blaming them on Iran, talking about any action taken by what they call proxies in the region, and they blame them on Iran. There's two things to remember. Number one, the American deaths that he refers to sometimes did not take place on the streets of American cities, except recently by ICE. They've taken place in the Middle East. And then one has to question, why were they in the Middle East to begin with? So Americans died in Lebanon going back to 1982. But that was not Iran. That was Lebanese resistance before Hezbollah came to existence. Hezbollah officially was declared a party and an organization in 1984. By then, the US embassy had been blown up in Beirut, and the US Marines were shot up and killed by a truck bomb in 83. So when you go to Syria, you go to Iraq, again, American troops were in places where they were not really protecting the homeland. They were protecting interests overseas. In the end of the day, although there is a very close relationship between Iran and its so-called proxies, it is not really Iran that gives orders. For all the support that Hezbollah receives from Iran, they don't take orders from Iran. In the end of the day, they make up their own decision. And sometimes that decision is in total sympathy or sync with Iran, but they make up their own decision. The same goes for Hamas, certainly. The same goes for the Houthis. So before blaming every incident of violence in the Middle East on Iran, you have to think of why these other actors are acting on their own and making up their own decisions, and what is it they are reacting against. Goes back to Palestine, goes back to Gaza, goes back to Lebanon. You think the Israelis are once again going back to occupying South Lebanon after they had occupied it for 18 years and had to leave. Now they're doing it again. Do the Lebanese who are fighting Israeli occupation need Iran to order them to fight? No. Israel is occupying their country and killing their people all over Lebanon. And the daily bombardment that the Israelis have engaged in Lebanon has not stopped since the so-called ceasefire with Hezbollah. And therefore, the Lebanese have a right to react and resist, as the Palestinians, certainly, after decades of occupation and mistreatment at the hands of the Israelis. and an existential threat that they have faced in the last 2 years at the hand of Israeli extreme right wing, have the right to resist. In fact, they must resist. And if you want peace, in addition to the diplomats ready to mediate, you need to stop the overall injustice that has occurred and is daily occurring to people. That would bring about peace. And the continuing bombardment of Iran will not. Thank you.
On that note, thank you, Dr. Khoury. Thank you, Heena. Thank you, Basha, and thank you, Fernando. It was wonderful having you. And this discussion was not just insightful, but brilliant and necessary. And I hope that maybe things, the war and the fighting settle down, and we can have a round two where we discuss and analyze what next for the region. Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Rohan. Thank you, everyone.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.